So a quick history of the American left. For organized labor, it really begins in the 1820s, 1830s with various mechanics groups on the east coast of the United States, particularly in New York City, parts of Massachusetts, Boston, uh, Baltimore was a major city at the time, and particularly Philadelphia, which was a hotspot for this. Um, I'm doing this completely extemporaneously, so I don't recall the names off the top of my head. But these proto unions basically were allied to Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party. Jackson, of course, was a planter from Tennessee and a former Army general who had waged war against the Seminoles in Florida. And he was not a friend of the working class in the sense that he wanted to empower them. He had no love for the industrial North, other than the love that he was supposed to project as president. But it was useful to him to empower unions to undermine the northern industrialists who were politically opposed to the southern planter class. Now, it is true that Jackson, threatened to lead the army to prevent secession and such. He wasn't an extremist. He was not a fire eater like John C. Calhoun, but um, he was still a Southerner, and he was still in favor of this. So the unions at the time, or the proto-unions, began their affiliation with the Democratic Party. Now, this changed with the election of Abraham Lincoln. Northern workers were not motivated by any moral basis, but they came to see their own economic interest in the destruction of the slave power, and they signed up for Lincoln's program. It helped that he was a protectionist, which he imported from the Whigs, the party that preceded the Republicans, and he was also a moderate and was not seen as a radical abolitionist. Moving forward, the unions pretty much stuck with the Republican Party, and particularly in the election of 1896. Now, this is interesting. William Jennings Bryan is often regarded as the first contemporary left wing in the contemporary Democratic sense. He was a populist. He supported the silver standard as opposed to the gold standard, but he was a free trader, and this would have undermined the security of the industrial unions. Now, his opponent, William McKinley, was a nationalist and a protectionist, pretty analogous to Trump's stated positions in 2016. And unlike Trump, he really acted on them. He slapped tariffs on virtually the whole world, and the unions stuck with him. As far as the social issues at the time, it's basically a wash. Bryan was a prohibitionist, and now that's interesting, and that would be an interesting subject for a dissertation on the dialectical development of prohibition as an issue in America, where you go from the Democrats favoring it in 1896 and the Republicans lukewarm. They had muddled on the issue throughout the years on their various platforms, to the Republicans being strongly in favor of it by the 20s, and then a Democrat and FDR repealing it. But that's neither here nor there. So that brings us into the 20th century. Woodrow Wilson was the first Democratic president to strongly court organized labor. And Wilson, again, was no friend of socialism or the socialists. He imprisoned Debs. He was not progressive in that sense, but he was pro-union. So again, unions are not inherently socialist. Paul Maddock makes an argument that I've always favored, that they're going to eventually dissolve down the line anyway, and they don't have any place in socialism. But again, that's neither here nor there. Unions split in the 20s between the Democrats and the Republicans. Yes, the Republicans at the time were conservative. Yes, Coolidge took a stand in Massachusetts and Boston against the policeman strike. But they were still protectionist, and that protectionism is really what unions gravitate towards. They need protectionist legislation. With the exception of the New Deal. FDR was a free trader, and here's why. He recognized them on a national basis. And this is celebrated to this day by the left. But all this has the effect of doing is capturing unions and integrating them into the Democratic Party political apparatus. It undermined the Republicans in the North. It ensured a readily mobilized voter base for FDR. So that's where we've remained ever since, with the exception of Ronald Reagan. Well, let's start with Nixon. In 1970 or 71, the Teamsters imported a bunch of hard hats to Wall Street in New York City. And these hard hats roughed up anti-war protesters. And that should indicate something of the character, the fundamental underlying character of unions. And to make matters worse, in 1980, they endorsed, some of them, including the Teamsters and select elements of the AFL-CIO, endorsed Ronald Reagan. So there are all kinds of developmental contradictions bound up in the history of unionism. The left doesn't really like to acknowledge them, you're anti-labor, but that just shows how hooked they are into the apparatus of bourgeois society.